Hello, Anthony. I'm going to start here. A good day to all our friends out there. I hope you can see us and hear us well. Let me formally welcome you to this lecture by Dr. Parag Khanna. This is the Ngee Kongsi-RSIS Distinguished Public Lecture. We normally would do this in the physical venue with many of you in the audience. As a result of the current situation of the coronavirus pandemic, we have to rely on this web and online platform to conduct our proceedings. Let me say that this afternoon we are hearing Dr. Khanna to talk about Asian leadership in the post-pandemic world. I think you will enjoy his presentation in a few minutes. But I want to say something about Dr. Khanna. He is a founder and managing partner of FutureMap. FutureMap is a data and scenario-based strategic advisory firm founded by Dr. Khanna. And he has also spent time writing many books. His current book on the shelf here in RSIS is entitled The Future is Asian: Commerce, Conflict and Culture in the 21st Century. So he comes to this afternoon lecture with a lot of knowledgeable information and experience. As a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, we in Asia are facing very significant challenges. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, has projected no growth for the economy in 2020. This is the first time in 60 years the IMF predicting that there is no growth in the global economy. And many of you have already read or are familiar with the kind of disruptions we have in our respective countries and the neighboring countries and the region we are in. As Dr. Khanna rightly points out in his brief summary for this public lecture, regionalization is the new globalization. We now have to think of how to work together with other countries in the same region, and from there, we move out to the rest of the world. In Southeast Asia, we have ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations. This is a regional organization consisting of 10 countries from Southeast Asia. And currently, Vietnam is the chair of ASEAN. Every year, one member country of ASEAN will be holding the chair. And Vietnam is actively pursuing its purpose of a cohesive and responsive ASEAN. Many meetings have been held, mostly on online platforms and through the web. But the important thing is that whatever channel we can keep open, we are there and we are discussing what can we do to deal with the challenges posed by COVID-19. Concerted global action is always difficult to achieve. Even though now we say we are not looking at global situation, we are now looking at ASEAN. It is also very tiring and getting 10 different member states of ASEAN to agree on any specific initiative. But anyway, we have no choice but to work together, and we hope that in the coming days and weeks, more cooperation across all our member states of ASEAN will bring us some relief and put some business back into action. As I mentioned earlier, we are fortunate to have Dr. Khanna here with us today to analyze the trajectory ahead for Asian leadership against the backdrop of geopolitical tensions and other challenges in the regional architecture. Maybe a few words about Dr. Khanna. I know all of you would have read the solid background he brings to this lecture this afternoon, but just a few highlights. Yeah, Dr. Khanna has been advisor to the US National Intelligence Council's Global Trend 2030 program. So these people, they spend their time studying what the future is like, yeah, and how to achieve what they want for the future. But he's there, in studying these developments. In Singapore, he has spent time at the Lee Kuan Yew School at his Center on Asia and Globalization. He has also been active at the New America Foundation. Yeah, this is what I call a relatively new think tank comprising all the brainy people that you can get to come together and look at all the challenges and find what can be done to prepare for the future. Dr. Khanna has spent time in Iraq and Afghanistan as a senior geopolitical advisor to the US Special Operations Forces there. He has a PhD in international relations from the London School of Economics, and he obtained his bachelor and master degree from Georgetown University at the School of Foreign Service. This introduction to this distinguished lecture will not be complete without acknowledging and recognizing the role played by Ngee Kongsi. This is a wonderful Singaporean organization that contributes tremendously to the education of our people, and it is a great supporter of educational institutions in Singapore, as well as other things. But we at the RSIS is ever grateful for the Ngee Kongsi Endowment, which allow us to organize this distinguished public lecture from time to time. Thank you again, Ngee Kongsi. Well, I think we should let Dr. Khanna speak now. Yeah, and then our plan is for him to speak for about 45 minutes, and then your questions can come in, and then we will throw some of these tough questions to him after his presentation. So over to you, Parag. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Ong. It's delightful to see you again, although unfortunately virtual this time around, so close yet so far away. I do hope we'll be able to do this in person again. I also, of course, want to extend my thanks to Ngee Kongsi for making this event possible and for their generous support for RSIS and for educational initiatives. I think we should all appreciate that Singapore is probably one of the only countries in the world right now where students at the university level, primary, secondary, are physically in school right now, and that's something we can be very thankful for. So even if we're doing this remotely, our children at least are in school right now. Well, let me jump in because I think this is a very important topic. And as you and I discussed in preparation, it is Asian leadership in the post-pandemic world, which does not mean necessarily a post-American world or a post-Western world. It is a world order that I believe is becoming ever more multipolar and therefore complex, because the characteristics of today's distributed multipolar system are very different and inherently geographically far wider in reach than European multipolar orders of the past or Western multipolar orders. So there are truly unprecedented aspects to the world today that the pandemic in many ways will reinforce. So I will, as you mentioned, spend about 35, 40 minutes illustrating these points. I want to begin by focusing on the internal dynamics of Asia, and then look at the Asianization of the world. And it's really a two-part structure that I would like to take. So why don't we begin with the first slide? And this slide should show the Asian center of gravity, the map of the world with a spotlight on Asia. And there what you can see is that most of the world's population lives in this Asian so not just hemisphere, but really this subsection. This is only about 1/6 or 1/7 of the world's surface area, but contains more than 50% of the world population. And what is remarkable is that this is true not only for now, but this may in fact always be true for the foreseeable generations. And the reason for that is that the world population growth has basically stopped. The world population will soon plateau. So the majority of the human population is not only in Asia today, but it will be tomorrow, and in 2030, and 2040, and 2050. And according to the most recent United Nations projections, the world population will peak before or around the year 2050. So it's an extraordinary time to be in Asia when it's not only fulfilling the notion that demography is destiny, strictly in terms of numbers, but also a time when Asia as a region is truly ascendant, collectively and in terms of individual powers. Now let's look at the next slide. And this is the slide titled 19th Century Ideology Meets COVID-19, a World of Longitudes. For those who are students of geopolitics, you'll be familiar with the notion of pan-regions. The notion of pan-regions is really germane to geopolitical thought. And the reason that this term emerged is because original geopolitical strategists focused on longitude more than latitude. They wanted to have control over the full longitudinal zone of a continent or continents in order to ensure a food production could be robust year-round, given the seasonal opposites of the northern and southern hemisphere. Now, what's striking to me is that suddenly our world of seamless, horizontal, latitudinal, transcontinental travel and trade has suddenly been restricted. And we've become not only a longitudinal, but very much a regional world again. And as we outlined in the preface for this, regionalization is becoming the new globalization. If you think about travel, of course, it will be a long time before people can simply hop across the Pacific Ocean so easily again. And so North America, Europe, and Asia are becoming these zones of gravity demographically, very much so, in terms of supply chains, business travel. In so many respects, there is a reset towards the region. We've certainly seen it in the migration of people during the COVID lockdown as they've all returned home to wherever their home may be. So that is reinforced also by the trends that began before the pandemic in terms of trade agreements and protectionism. The US-China trade war, for example, made it such that the US trades more with Canada and more with Mexico individually than it does with China. So this regionalism has become quite a profound trend. We're also seeing countries encourage investments to come back home from abroad. So in America, it's called Buy American. There is also European equivalents, subsidies very much favoring domestic and regional industries. So are we moving back towards this world that is pan-regional more than and longitudinal than global? That is a question worth exploring. And within that, again, Asia is the largest region, most diverse, most number of countries, and largest economically. That is illustrated in the next slide, if we can look at the slide that is titled Rise of the Asian Economic System. Now here you see in purchasing power parity terms, the size of each major global region or continent. You can see that the United States in PPP terms has an $18.5 trillion GDP and is certainly the largest economy in North America. Europe, if you take the individual, particularly core European economies together, you have still a pillar of the global economic system. But Asia, of course, is the largest when measured in PPP terms. China being the largest, but India an almost $9 trillion PPP GDP. Now, I've coded these by color so that in order to reflect the gravity of trade within the regions. As discussed, North American countries are trading more with each other, Europeans more with each other, Asians more with each other. So these are becoming increasingly coherent economic regions. Now, of course, Europe has been for decades, North America as well. It's Asia that is growing more together. And as I said, I wanted to talk about the Asianization of Asia as well as the Asianization of the world. Let's go to the next slide. And this is titled Bigger Than China, the Asianization of Asia. Now, if you remember from the first slide, the demographics, a total Asian population of 4.6 billion people, roughly, of which China represents 1.4 billion. Therefore, there are approximately 3 billion Asians who are not of the Chinese population. So Asia is, of course, a very large, very diverse region. And what has been happening over the last 30 years is that all parts of Asia have been getting more connected to each other. So what is the main trigger? What happened 30 years ago? Well, of course, it was the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the Cold War and the sort of splintering of Asia that actually dates back not just 30 years, but really 500 years with colonialism. So the end of both colonialism and the Cold War in the 20th century meant that Asian countries were able to recover some of those organic, economic or commercial, as well as cultural and other linkages that they have had in previous eras of the Silk Roads. So 30 years in the making is the data on this map, where you can see the bilateral trade volumes from the year 2018 between pairs of Asian countries. And I went back for this data to the year 2005, 2010, 2015, and then up to the present almost, to see how each and every dyad, each and every pair of subregions or countries has seen their trade volumes expand. As we know, when it comes to the maritime trade, the Indian Ocean has displaced the Atlantic Ocean in terms of the volume of trade. When it comes to the energy sector, most certainly far more Persian Gulf oil and gas flows east to India, China, Japan, and South Korea. We have seen growing trade between India and Japan, India and Korea, India and ASEAN, Australia with all other Asians, and so forth. So really any combination. And most certainly, of course, China's trade relations with every country on this map. China is already the #1 trading partner of more than 110 or more countries, which makes it the largest trading partner of more than twice as many countries as the United States is. And it's the largest trading partner of most countries in Asia. So China is at the center of Asia, but all of the bilateral relationships have been blossoming. And that is a very important point to bear in mind when we think about how investment dynamics, Belt and Road, and so forth will play out. So I will come back to that shortly. Let's go to the next slide, slide number that's called Regionalization Displaces Globalization. So I want to here just again recap some of this data. And I hope that people can feel free to have a copy of these slides afterwards to have a closer look for reference. Now, I mentioned that the trade volumes internal to each region exceed the trade externally. And that gap will continue to grow, both because of COVID and because of the ratification of very relevant trade agreements in recent years. At the same time, the political pressure in North America for nearshoring will probably remain strong, irrespective of who wins the US election. Also, the US, Canada, and Mexico are really rediscovering their demographic and resource complementarities. I refer to it very much as a North American Union, even though, of course, that is not institutionally what it is called. When it comes to Europe, we've all seen that they are shifting from just the monetary union that they have towards greater fiscal consolidation. This has happened in response, of course, to the crisis, but that is often how Europe does evolve, is learning from crisis experience. Now they are finally issuing what amount to sovereign bonds, so mutualized sovereign debt offerings. This is what people are calling a fiscal union through the back door. Be that as it may, we're also seeing that the subsidies, the bailouts, the stimulus is very much tied towards pro-European business support. And then we have Asia. Now, Asia in the last 20 years has weathered multiple storms and crises and learned from them, and also taken the advantage of the opportunity to deepen its integration. After 1998, there were lessons learned about the need for reforms in building more trade surpluses and reserves, depegging or moving towards floating exchange rates, privatization, and other reforms that were undertaken. After 2008, the demand shock of the financial crisis taught us here in Asia that we have to have more internal trade in order to offset the decline in exports to Europe and to the United States. Now with COVID, all of these lessons come together because we need more internal integration as supply chains are cut off. We need more trade with each other to compensate for less access to markets. We certainly need more reform of capital markets, given the sort of portfolio capital outflow and declining foreign investment in the region. Current accounts are widening, so we need more stimulus, and so on and so forth. So these lessons are being learned, and they're kicking in relatively quickly. So we see that the stimulus policies of Asian governments, even those that are less wealthy, match in terms of the resources put forward those of other countries. And the sequencing, the rapid deployment of these resources show that Asian countries, even developing countries, have learned from this playbook and are implementing it successfully. Now, although the IMF, as Ambassador said, predicts zero growth this year, if any region is going to actually recover and post any growth in the next year or two, it's certainly going to be the Asian region, led naturally by China, where they're back on track, having eradicated to some degree COVID. We also have, let's move to the next slide, the evolution of trade agreements that is supporting this deeper integration. Now, the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, that was put forward by most Asian countries last year, was of course very well timed on the one hand to advance deeper regional integration, but on the other hand, of course, COVID has disrupted it to some degree. However, the sentiment, the legislation is in place, the ambition is there to take advantage of bringing down further internal barriers and to shift supply chains accordingly, to spread wealth, to boost investment. Now, I think it's a very promising agreement because it benefits both the wealthy countries and the poorer countries in the region. The wealthier countries, such as Japan, Korea, and so forth, can sell their high-end technologies, sensor networks, robotics, Internet of Things, and so on, telecommunication services. And the poorer countries are capturing the lower wage supply chains, textiles, manufacturing, and so forth. And even before COVID, on the back of the trade agreements, the opening of ASEAN markets, the supply chain shifts, the US-China trade war, all of these forces were pushing supply chains into Southeast Asia, and that trend will certainly be accelerated by COVID. Now, the next slide, the one with the multicolored map of Asia, this is useful to remind everyone of the potential of Asia as a whole economically. Because we have in the last some years fallen into a trap of viewing Asia mostly in Sino-centric terms, as China has become the world's largest economy. However, for historical context, it's important to remember that Asia has gone through multiple growth waves and continues to experience these waves before, during, and after China's rise and success. Because really Japan represents the first wave of modern Asian growth. It took only 25 years or about 30 years for Japan to go from the horrors of World War II to become the world's second largest economy, which it became in approximately the year 1975. So Japan represents the first wave of modern Asian growth. And the Japanese story inspired, of course, the tiger economies, of which Singapore, of course, is one. South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, the tiger economies, saw the Japanese economic miracle, reproduced some of the elements of modernization, industrialization, import substitution, and so forth. And then, by that point in history, it brings us to the late 1970s and early 1980s. In fact, as some of you know, just today or yesterday, in the city of Shenzhen, they began officially celebrating the 40th anniversary of the city's establishment as a special economic zone. And that process 40 years ago is what kicked off China becoming the third wave of modern Asian growth. So China fits right in the middle of the story. Now, what's important is that when we view Asia in national and geopolitical terms and through these territorial prisms, we often neglect the fact that Japan and the tiger economies, most certainly Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore as well, and Japan too, especially in the last 25 years, have been China's largest foreign investors. So these are not zero-sum blocks rivaling each other up until this point in history. Far more, it's a story of mutually reinforcing waves in which each set of countries, as it modernizes and gets wealthy, invests in the next wave and next set of countries. And that is the story that is unfolding now again as we enter the fourth wave of Asian growth, which is the countries colored in orange, South and Southeast Asia, from Pakistan through India, through the ASEAN countries. Now here what's striking is that the population of these countries in orange totals 2.5 billion people. So the majority of the Asian population is actually these maritime South and Southeast Asian countries whose populations are very young. The median age is 10 or 15 years younger than that of China, except for Thailand, which is about the same. And of course, they're poorer countries, but their growth rates pre-COVID were quite impressive. And if they can get back to those rates, one can foresee that within the next decade, the collective GDP of these countries in orange will be about the same GDP as China today. And now again, poorer, younger, but growing fast or on that trajectory. And clearly, once they reach that collective GDP size, even as not as a single state, but a collection of countries, that represents a very, very sizable market. So Asia really has multiple economic engines. They don't necessarily have to be growth engines in terms of their domestic economies, such as Japan. But as everyone knows, Japan also plays a very positive role around the region in terms of its capital allocation, spread of technology, and so forth. So again, who are the largest investors in the fourth wave economies? It is Japan, it is Singapore, and it is China. So again, the first, second, and third waves are actually part of the reason why the fourth wave is emerging. And that, to me, is the correct sequence of understanding Asia's collective economic rise. And so what you have is really a system, an Asian system. And the premise of my most recent work really takes this word as a very central concept. In international relations theory, when we talk about systems, we very often are referring either to imperial systems of the past, to alliance systems, or regional orders, such as that of Europe. So a European system has been in existence for millennia. It's been a conflictual, warlike, a hostile system, but a system nonetheless. Because a system does not refer to whether its dynamics are peaceful or conflictual. It refers to the intensity of relations. That is the fundamental characteristic of a system, the intensity of relations. But nowhere did I see in the literature people talking about an Asian system. We talked about the historical efforts to create a hegemonic order, an American alliance system leading Asia, the attempt at a Japanese-led order that caused World War II in the region, and historically Chinese-centric orders and systems, such as under the Ming Dynasty or the tributary system that's appeared in multiple eras, but not a collective pan-Asian system. And that is, in my argument, is where Asia is headed, into an internally distributed, not just China at the center, but multipolar, but cohesive system. And again, just to emphasize, it does not have to be peaceful. It's about the intensity of relations. Now let's go to the next slide titled East meets West. And this again brings us back to the full geographical scope of Asia. Because when we speak about the Asian system, absolutely China is perhaps the single most important driver of the underlying connectivity that is allowing Asian countries to knit their ties more closely together. However, the story is, going back to the collapse of the Soviet Union, a 30-year-old story. And before China was the factory floor of the world, before China was a large recipient of foreign investment and investing massively in infrastructure through Belt and Road, it was also happening in its early phases, supported by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, supported by the Asian Development Bank, the Japanese government, and others. So China has lent its weight in the last 10, 15 years very, very strongly towards the broader process of intra-Asian connectivity, and more broadly, Eurasian infrastructural connectivity. And that is the overarching story or narrative of the last 30 years. So Belt and Road is a subset of that. Eurasian infrastructure finance is not a subset of Belt and Road. Belt and Road is a subset of Eurasian infrastructure finance. Belt and Road can be strong one year or weak another year. It can be robust in some countries, weak in other countries, very far along and developed for over a long period of time in some relationships, and very nascent in other relationships. But that is all part of the story of Asian countries organically reconnecting with each other. And this map shows you many of, but now there are many more, existing and planned projects that relate to railways, pipelines, highways, electricity grids, internet routes, hydro canals, and so on and so forth. But broadly, what you see again is getting back to combining the demographics and the geography. The majority of the human population lives on this slide. So when we talk about the Asianization of the world, logically, the only thing that has to happen for the world to become more Asian is for Asia to become more Asian, for Asians' primary relationships to be with each other. And Asia's principal contribution to the world in terms of global governance need not be, it certainly can be and is, but it does not have to be anything more than Asia being stable, being prosperous, being sustainable in and of itself, because that alone represents the majority of humankind now and in perpetuity. That said, this infrastructural connectivity within Asia and in Eurasia more broadly is a sign of the return of the geopolitics driven by connectivity, what I have called competitive connectivity. And to me, competitive connectivity is embodied in the ways in which infrastructure is being used to deepen ties between countries, while also providing the platform for economic growth. And what we see is that, again, with the majority of the countries in the region being post-colonial countries or post-Soviet countries, their populations have doubled or tripled in the last 75 years since they became independent. And yet their infrastructure has been very weak, rudimentary, dilapidated. So I generally support these efforts to elevate economies through this fixed capital formation investment. And it's been proven to have a multiplier effect on growth and to induce the kinds of reforms that bring in investment. The RAND Corporation, an American think tank, has actually called Belt and Road win-win. So has Citigroup, an American bank. Now, right now, we have a lot of ideological discourse about Belt and Road. Is it debt trap diplomacy, or is it genuinely beneficial? The truth will depend on individual cases that we will look at, but by and large, it is revealing of the fundamental truism that cross-border connectivity is the true foundation, obviously, of our global trade. Now, what we do see happening, as I mentioned, is that where you have new infrastructure built, you have youth populations moving into cities, you can have economic diversification, job creation, countries growing, and hopefully being able to pay down their debts. That is the correct sequence and desirable sequence of events. In some countries it happens, in others it doesn't. Let's look at slide number 10, showing you the map with the vectors. What I wanted to demonstrate here is that we must stop generalizing about Belt and Road. A lot of people speak about it as all or nothing, switched on, switch off, hot or cold, sort of in favor or out of favor. And the truth is that, like global infrastructure finance itself, it's something much more complex. And we cannot generalize about the ways in which individual countries are responding to China and dealing with China in the implementation of projects or in the scope and scale that has been determined. So I give you some examples here, and we don't have to talk through all of them, but as we know that with Russia, for example, Russia is considered the most compliant, if you will, of countries with Belt and Road. China's trade and foreign investment relationship with Russia now exceeds that of Germany. That's set to continue to grow. We see other countries, though, where despite the fact that Chinese investment is growing, diplomatic relations remain tense. We can see that with Indonesia, for example. We can also see in cases such as Malaysia and Thailand that depending on the character of relations, political relations between China and them, China may shift projects, shift emphasis to more favorable terms and conditions. A country like Pakistan, has been very loyal as an ally of China, a client state for much of the past 60 years. Just yesterday or in the last couple of weeks, it's been reported that a number of new Belt and Road projects are going to move forward, electricity, transportation, and so forth. I mentioned earlier that countries that are really smart in playing the diplomatic and commercial game will use investment to diversify and grow and open their economies to global investment. And that is something that Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are doing very successfully as well. So there isn't really one answer to how Belt and Road plays out. Some countries that are very poor and owe the majority of their outstanding sovereign debt to creditors such as China, or specifically to China, actually had China as their largest creditor before Belt and Road. And the fact is that those countries were in some ways orphaned by capital markets and turned to China and relied on China and continue to. And therefore the solution, rather than criticizing China, is to go back to the point that I made earlier, to participate in this infrastructure arms race. And I call it the infrastructure arms race because we do now have a competitive set of players that are seeking to finance infrastructure at competitive lending rates. If we look at the next slide, the one called Sovereign Rivals to BRI, There I have wanted to point out that 3 or 4 years ago, there did not exist a United States International Finance and Development Corporation, USIFDC. Australia had not expanded its infrastructure finance facility. The Japan, US, Australia Blue Dot certification network for infrastructure finance did not exist. The Japan-India connectivity corridors didn't exist. The EU-Japan partnership for sustainable infrastructure finance also didn't exist. So why do we all of a sudden have all of these initiatives aimed at extending credit lending to developing countries in Asia? Why have they emerged in the last 3 years? Well, of course, it's a response to Belt and Road. And therefore, you have now a marketplace, if you will, for these services. And I think that is going to characterize the future very strongly. And the countries that are successful in this infrastructure arms race are those that don't choose one side or the other side, but rather they practice what I have long called multi-alignment. Multi-alignment means not aligning with one side or the other, but getting the best deal from all possible suitors or vendors in this geopolitical marketplace. And that's what I see the countries of Central Asia doing. And that's what some ASEAN countries here in Southeast Asia are doing as well. Now let's go to the next slide called From Rule Takers to Rule Makers. As I mentioned, it would be enough for Asia to develop its own diplomatic order, system, institutions that peacefully govern this region with the majority of the world's population. But something more than that is happening. For those of us who have some background in the global governance field, we very often talked about global governance strictly from the perspective of the post-war Western-led multilateral system. But what we were missing at the time was the ways in which Asian institutions, governments are coming together to build their own inside-out order, as I call it. So here you see not only the membership in the Trans-Pacific Partnership versus the Asian versus the RCEP. You see ASEAN +3, and on the left, the membership in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, which is growing all the time. Now there's 100 countries that are either members or associated members of the AIIB, and it includes many European governments. It even includes South American countries that are members in the AIIB. So it's truly a global institution, probably the fastest growing membership multilateral organization in the world. And what's striking there is, again, it's not just Asian members, but others. And it means that even though Asians and the AIIB have borrowed from the playbook of the EBRD, of the World Bank, of the ADB, now they are modifying those rules. It is Asian-driven, Asian-founded, of course, Chinese-led, but with a broad membership. India is the second largest shareholder. India is also the second largest recipient of loans. But Europeans are very strongly participating, and this is what brings us to the point about how these different regions, especially the principal regions of North America, Europe, and Asia, will relate to each other in the future. Because unlike the United States, which opposes Belt and Road and tried to convince its European allies not to join the AIIB 5 years ago, most of them did anyway. And that reveals a rift in transatlantic relations and a strengthening of Eurasian relations. So if we can go to the next slide, this is called From Transatlantic to Eurasian. And what you see here is in the circles, the share of global trade represented by these major regions of the world. So Europe represents 38% of global trade, largely because of its internal trade, but also its extensive trade with Asia, which is actually the largest interregional trade pairing in the world is Europe and Asia. So Europe trades more with Asia than it does with North America. So this, again, this transatlantic axis, economic and strategic, is fraying for several reasons that are diplomatic and political, but also very much commercial and economic. And Europeans have made their decision about how they want to engage with Asia quite differently from the United States. Because whereas American trade with Asia is flat, in the case of trade with China has declined, European trade with Asia is growing rapidly. Europe wants to have more free trade agreements. It now has a free trade agreement with Japan, already one with Korea, Singapore, working with other ASEAN countries like Vietnam, and eventually beginning some negotiations with India, and of course seeking to push very hard on China for reciprocity. So the European approach, even though Europeans are quite adamant now about investment restrictions on China into Europe, again, to the extent that that there needs to be reciprocity for that to happen, and it can't be sensitive sectors and so forth, they are pushing to engage more with Asia, not to abandon Asia. There's no debate about that in Europe. In fact, they're genuinely trying to evolve and deepen and strengthen their Asia strategies. So if there is going to be any decoupling in the world, in my view, this term is not necessarily the central axis of global economic ties is not really the US and China, because in many ways they've already become quite decoupled. China trades more with ASEAN than it does with the United States. So the first decoupling is simply Asianization, the intra-Asian trade substituting for trade with the United States, in particular North America in general. But the recoupling of Europe and Asia is the most significant new growth corridor. And so you could imagine a Eurasian decoupling from North America, because as you see here, North America, again, is really the smallest share of global trade of the major regions. So because the US and in North America have such a self-sufficiency, they don't actually need trade as much as we do in Asia or as much as Europeans do. And so I don't think that in Washington there's a sufficient appreciation or understanding of how these macro dynamics are playing out. Let me make a final couple of comments. Let's go to the next slide about Southeast Asia. Now, I've mentioned already that owing to the last 10 years of Japanese investors and corporates and Western seeking the lower cost of production in Southeast Asia, looking for more open markets with more favorable investment rules and regulations, ASEAN has been thriving. ASEAN has been catching up to China in foreign investment. The GDP of ASEAN has exceeded that of India, with only half the population of India. And ASEAN countries since 1998 have been doing a lot of things correctly in terms of their market reforms, economic reforms more broadly, in some cases political reforms, as well as emphasizing connectivity. Because of course, no individual ASEAN country can compete with China as a production center, but the region as a whole certainly can if it can get more seamlessly integrated internally. What has benefited the region is that Korea and Japan, among others, have been seeking to recreate the vertically integrated supply chain clusters that they have. Think of Nagoya in Japan for Toyota, or Samsung City in South Korea, to reproduce these clusters, if you will, in countries like Vietnam, like Thailand, and to a lesser degree Indonesia now. And as that happens, that rapidly helps countries modernize and mature. One of the phenomena that's happening is that as the aging but technologically advanced and wealthy countries like Japan and South Korea and Singapore, as they do get older, they increase their investments into the developing lower cost of production countries and help move them up the value chain. Simultaneously, even China has been shifting its investment outward to capitalize on ASEAN countries being participants both in RCEP and TPP, for example. So this region is doing those things correctly. So those are some of the economic and strategic underlying issues in terms of how Asia has been growing together over the past 30 years, how Asia has been sort of Asianizing itself. And now we'll talk a little bit about how and we've already mentioned a bit around global rulemaking, around infrastructure finance, for example, as a critical litmus test of Asia's gravity in the world. Of course, when it comes to conflict dynamics, most of the world's conflict scenarios, potential conflict zones are here in Asia as well. So it's part of the logic of the intensification of relations of countries in a system that there be more friction. It's part and parcel of the definition. It doesn't, if there is a conflict, whether it is in the South China Sea or between China and India, North Korea, that does not invalidate the notion that Asia is a system. It is the evidence, it is the very evidence that Asia is becoming a more closely knit system, that we have these frictions that need to be resolved. And some may indeed be resolved violently, others hopefully diplomatically and peacefully. I've recently written an essay going through 8 conflict scenarios here in Asia and advocating an approach based on border settlements and how that can help to restore confidence in cross-border ties in Asia and continue us all on the path towards having more complementary ties in the region. That's going to take a lot of leadership and a lot of effort. And I hope that right now, at this time where there's a lot of concern about the reliability of Western powers such as the US, and generally speaking, a desire of Asians to prove themselves to be mature and capable of managing their own affairs, that we can overcome some of these legacy disputes that date back to colonial era border demarcations. So I'll make a final couple of points about Asian intellectual leadership and cultural leadership before closing. And this is just stylistic, but if you look at the next slide, I wanted to, in some ways, quantify, this was for the book, The Futureization, I wanted to sort of quantify the presence and the resonance, the visibility of Asian ideas and culture in the global marketplace. And of course, going back a century, there's been a recognition of the brilliance of Indian filmmaking, Chinese filmmaking, and so forth in the West. Directors such as Satyajit Ray of India, and of course Crazy Rich Asians, which probably did more for the Singapore brand than anything in the last few years. In literature, I counted the number of Asians that have been awarded Nobel Prizes and other literary prizes. There too you see a growing recognition of Asian cultural output. In music, the popularity of K-pop speaks for itself around the world. Asian food, Asian spirituality and other customs, the presence of Asian athletes globally, Asian comedians as well. All of these are a sign. Of course, people learning Asian languages, foreign students coming and studying in Asia. These are of the many, many, many telltale signs that in all corners of the world, you see a growing Asianization. And what I documented in the book is this happening in Africa, the Middle East, Europe, North America, and South America. So really everywhere in the world, there's a tangible connection to Asia that is deepening. Now, what about Asian values? Now, I know that this will be an interesting topic to discuss further if we go to the next slide. The term Asian values has its roots, of course, in discourse here in Singapore, in Malaysia, in the 1990s, and in China, looking at largely premised around Confucian values and what they tell us about political culture and governance styles. But after the Asian financial crisis, the term fell into disfavor. So for about 2 decades, really, very few people used the term Asian values. What I sought to do is to revive this term, but of course to recast it in a post-Confucian way and in a pan-Asian way. And I set out to answer the question, if all the countries or societies of Asia, even including Israel and Arab countries, Russia, Japan, China, Thailand, Indonesia, even Indians, South Asians, could we all agree on certain values or systems? And I tried to come up with 3 ideas or categories where even across democracies and non-democracies, you have some intellectual coherence and resonance of principles. And one of them is technocratic governance, because both democracies and non-democracies in Asia appreciate a strong executive branch, a modernizing leader, willing to extend a long tenure, shelf life, high trust in government to implement that agenda or mandate around a vision of national modernization. So the strong role for a technocratic executive, and of course Singapore is the archetype, the paragon for that. And part of that lies not just in the executive, but in the civil service. And whereas we've seen the civil service authority erode in countries like the United States or in Great Britain, here it's strengthened. And I use data from the World Bank in the book to document the improved quality of governance and capability and capacity of governance across Asian countries over the last 5 to 10 years to demonstrate that that has in fact been happening. So Asian countries, some have been democratizing, others have been backsliding, but almost all of them have been strengthening their governance capacity. And ultimately, it is that stateness that allows our countries to modernize from where they have come from. The second principle is mixed capitalism. So the role of the state in the economy is not really hotly debated in Asia. It's welcomed. There are nuances to it, whether it's regulatory, whether it is through industrial supports and other measures. But broadly speaking, we have mixed capitalism, again, both in democracies and non-democracies. And the third is social conservatism, which is, again, of course, not a universal, it's not disputable, it's not indisputable, but it is a common fact or feature. And I use as a proxy for this issue internet governance and regulation, where we see a certain caution around the tolerance for fake news, especially in political issues and sensitivities here in Asia. And what we found is that even liberal democracies like Australia are following the lead of countries in Asia, other countries in Asia, even Singapore, in having a very cautious approach towards how sort of free speech is governed and how fake news is governed on the internet, seeing the very negative effects that that has had on Western democracies, again, especially during elections. So I believe that these three principles stand for the new Asian values. They are not equally distributed, not equally believed, not equally deeply embedded, but they are aspirational in many ways for many Asian countries. And I think that we can have a very healthy dialogue across very diverse Asian countries about the role that these Asian values play as we all seek to improve our standards of governance. And now the final slide, titled The Return of Afro-Eurasia, to conclude on this topic of Asian leadership. I wanted to bring together, you have almost the whole global population here, barring, of course, the Western hemisphere. But what's remarkable is, as I said earlier, we are moving into a phase that is beyond the colonial world and beyond the Cold War world. And those two phases, colonialism, the Cold War, have characterized the last 500 years of history. And yet we are returning towards the pre-colonial map of global relations and connectivity. And there was a term for that. Scholars and historians of the pre-colonial world call it Afro-Eurasia. And of course, it's a wonderful word because it captures Africa, Europe, and Asia in one single word. And the trade routes that we see blossoming, especially across the Indian Ocean and the new Silk Roads across Eurasia, are reminiscent of the pre-colonial patterns of interaction when, before the full colonization and integration of the Western Hemisphere into the global economy, Afro-Eurasia effectively was the global system. And so it is becoming again today. And Asia's role in this Afro-Eurasian system is clearly outsized, demographically, economically, culturally, diplomatically, strategically. And so, in a way, the Asian leadership in the post-pandemic world will be proven most of all in its role in the Afro-Eurasian system here on this map. And it remains to be seen how exactly it will play out, whether it will again whether there will be a long era of peace, whether there will be conflict followed by peace. But there is an organic reality, an organic symmetry, and a return to these past models that I find very promising, because this was, for all of us who know our history in this period of history, this was a very prosperous era. And I hope that therefore serves as a very good and positive guidance for how Asia exercises its leadership in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Parag Khanna, for that wonderful lecture. I have already received quite a few questions. So in the interest of time, I will not say more, but maybe to just throw some of these questions to you, Parag, and then maybe you can answer them briefly, because I think the good thing is to go through as many of the questions from the audience as possible. The first guy that I got here is skeptical about what you have just said about Asian leadership. His main complaint is that you look at the Asian context, there are so many quarrelsome government and people arguing with one another, and there seems no unity. Even ASEAN countries are not able to come together to deal with certain specific challenges. And the RCEP, there is still a dispute whether it is good for Asia or not good for Asia. So this questioner is asking, on this basis, why are you so optimistic about Asia in the next decade or the next century?
I want to be absolutely clear that Asian leadership does not equal Asian unity, nor does it require that Asia have a single leader or that Asia be supranational. Both of these are false straw men or archetypes or models that do not derive from Asian history or from Asian realities. So if one is skeptical about the idea of Asian leadership, it's largely due to these definitional and logical twists that have to be navigated. Because when people speak about Asia being unified, it clearly reflects a bias towards a European notion that there needs to be a supranational unity. But Asia, but Europe, the sum total of European leadership and influence in the world is not simply what is dictated by the European Union in Brussels. There is German influence, Italian influence, French influence, British influence, and even with Britain leaving the European Union, you still have a collective European footprint on the world that is very profound, economically, culturally, diplomatically, and otherwise. And so too with Asian leadership. Of course, we should never expect there to be a supranational Asian Union. As the questioner has rightly pointed out, even in ASEAN, we have a tremendous amount of difficulty speaking with one voice and perhaps will not speak with one voice. But that does not mean that Asia's collective leadership in the world, through the bilateral steps that are taken, through the multilateral convergence that is occurring within the region, and the global economic, demographic, and other footprints that Asians have, does not constitute influence. Influence, and in many ways, agenda-setting leadership. And we see that happening everywhere. We see it happening in the existing multilateral order. We see it happening within Asian institutions. So it's really a definitional question, because there is a teleology that people often have in their heads that leadership must equal unity. And it's something that Europe both represents and fails at doing at the same time, but it is the wrong model for how Asia asserts itself in the world.
Thank you. I want to go on to the next question before I comment on what you had just said about ASEAN. The question is that from some of the electoral results you see in the region, in Asian country in particular, the younger generation seem to prefer a more open Western-style democratic system instead of the traditional Asian form of governance. And now with this kind of disposition towards more what we call Western-style kind of open society, would that make life more difficult for your thesis?
Well, I think that there is a significant difference between the conversation and the principles that underpin liberalism and liberal culture versus formal democratic democracy and electoral democracy, right? You can have one without the other in either direction. That's why we often distinguish between illiberal democracies and liberal democracies. You can have liberal non-democracies, as well as, of course, illiberal non-democracies. So there are 4 quadrants to choose from. Asian youth, no doubt, we can see this in Thailand with the protests right now. We can see this in a number of countries where youth certainly push for liberalism and certainly want to have more political voice and representation. But in a number of countries, they elect and are the leaders who are still quite popular, fashion themselves as strong executive technocrats, such as Modi in India, such as Jokowi in Indonesia. Were favored by youth, but again, are considered to be an example of a strong central leader, even if they fail to execute. Duterte is another example. Now, it's important to point out that Modi in India, Duterte in the Philippines, Jokowi in Indonesia are three relatively popular leaders, actually very popular when compared with Western leaders. Again, Asian populations have Asian governments have very high degrees of public support compared to Western societies. So it is possible to become both more liberal and more democratic, but also more technocratic at the same time. I think it's very embedded in the question is a sentiment that I very strongly agree with, which is that Asian governments, whether they are democratic or not democratic, need to take youth interests and priorities into account in formulating public policy. Otherwise, eventually, they will fall, either at the ballot box or through protests or other means. So the responsiveness of government and the necessity for government to be more responsive is the key hinge here. But with that Asian societies, because of demographic change, youthfulness, globalization, that they are becoming more liberal, I have no doubt that is what is happening. But at the same time, do they want to see rudderless, populist, flailing, sort of Anglo-Saxon democracy? I don't think that many people in this region want to see that. So let's not talk about Asia heading in the direction of Western-style governance. Let's talk about Asian governance evolving in directions that suit, Asian requirements, and maintaining a very strong professional civil service would be something that many Western countries are not doing, but it would represent Asia getting the balance right.
Yeah, good one. I also wanted to follow up on that point with this question from another viewer. The question is, apart from China and its BRI and other policy initiative, can the other part of Asia actually coalesce and work to assert this important role in the New World Order? Is there a New World Order?
Well, some would say a New World disorder. To me, order is strictly defined as the distribution of power in the world. We have a multipolar global order. We have a North American power center. We have a European power center. And we have multiple Asian powers, China being the most significant, but Japan, India, and others. So you have a global multipolarity and you have an Asian multipolarity. So you have multipolarity within a multipolarity. That would be an accurate assessment of global order. Global order also means, of course, a legitimate scaffolding of norms, rules, institutions, and so forth. But that is not necessary itself for there to be an accurate assessment of the distribution of power. So it would be nice to have a normative order, a collective vision, collective global governance, but it isn't essential for there to be global stability. Because technically we do have global stability today. We've not had a major power conflict yet, and we have not had in decades. Now, we do have to appreciate the role of other powers as well. Again, the role of Japan, the role of India. People take a very static, linear, short-term view of these power dynamics, as if China's pathway towards the superpower status that it has achieved is irrevocable, and that it leads and that it entails a substitution of American hegemony with Chinese hegemony. But I don't believe that any such thing will happen. I think that the reality of multipolarity is more powerful than the reality that China is a superpower. As I say in the book, China's rise does not replace multipolarity. China's rise affirms multipolarity because the United States remains a pole, Europe remains a pole, and so forth. So what we all have to get used to, both intellectually and in the conceptually and in the real world, is that this multipolar structure is quite a permanent feature, I think, of the global system. And all powers coexist and are competing within that, but the likelihood of one replacing the other is very slim. And we have a rapid evolution with the rise of India as well, and other powers that are claiming and asserting themselves. Russia also belongs there. And of course, we do have very strong strategic dynamics, such as the rise of the Quad countries, Japan, Australia, India, the United States, and associated countries partnering more with each other. So there are a lot of shifting dynamics here, and therefore, I have argued that we appreciate the Asian multipolarity as much as the global multipolarity.
Parag, I think we are coming to the close of our session, but I still have quite a few questions. If you don't mind, we can go on a few more minutes.
Sure.
Yeah. So there are at least 3 more questions on my screen here. One question is about the role of mixed capitalism. And the concern from the guy who posed this question is that there are big companies, what they call government-linked company or state-owned enterprises. Some of them have huge debt, and yet they are still crowding out the private sector investors. So from you put on your economic hat a little bit and see, how do you reconcile this kind of situation with what you just said about the future of mixed capitalism in Asia?
Well, actually, the question itself is providing the evidence of the mixed capitalism, because, of course, GLCs and SOEs are the embodiments of aspects of mixed capitalism here in Asia. Now, again, we have a wide spectrum. We do have open capitalist economies like India, Japan, Korea, and so forth. But even there, of course, as we know, there are favored industrial conglomerates that play a very strong role and have regulatory preferences and subsidies that they benefit from. So there is no one way to generalize about this. Mixed capitalism is the principle, but it is embodied in many different ways. Not in all countries do SOEs crowd out private investment. China is very much a hybrid model. It has a thriving, an enormous private sector that by many estimates represents better than 50% of the economy. Does it also have these zombie companies, SOEs, and those that are part of represent a very large sort of the total composition of debt in the economy are represented by those companies. So, of course, restructuring that debt, writing down that debt, and so forth, and turning those companies to some degree into more functional and semi-privatized kinds of companies is part of what the Chinese economy is doing right now is in its deleveraging process. Elsewhere, what we're seeing is that, especially in light of COVID and the desire for stronger reforms and more dynamic economies, countries from India to Indonesia to the Philippines to Vietnam are promising to privatize more assets. And this tends to happen in periods where foreign investment is drying up and suddenly there's a need to attract more capital, and therefore to float or to list or to privatize and sell off state assets becomes a necessary instrument. And that's precisely the phase we're in right now. So we will see more private activity for sure in these economies as those assets are sold off. So again, I would not paint a static picture nor a uniform or universal picture of how mixed capitalism plays out in Asian economies. But needless to say, again, there is a strong incentive and desire of the state to play a role. Again, sometimes picking winners, providing strong subsidies, in other cases, blocking out foreign competition, and various other ways in which the government can be involved in the economy.
Thank you for that. Maybe the last 2 questions, I was zeroing a bit about ASEAN and Singapore. Well, there is a question about how can ASEAN, with all its differences, contribute to this Asian system. Yeah. Um,
Well, I know that you are the world's expert on this question, but I'll just weigh in briefly. Look, I am a believer in Southeast Asia as a region, given the organic potential, the geography, again, the youthfulness, the reforms underway, all of these virtues that this region possesses. As I like to, explain to people, in periods of history, every region, has its time in the sun, where that confluence of modernization, infrastructure investment, industrialization, a young population, and inward investment, political reforms are all happening at roughly the same time. And it gives the country a strong, the region a strong momentum. And that's what is happening right now in ASEAN, and that's a very positive story. It's not a magical story, it's simply an alignment of these forces that's underway. But ASEAN as a diplomatic body is a different question, right? It's derivative. It can only help to amplify that potential further. In some ways it does. Of course, when we look at ASEAN strictly as an institution, many of us would like to see a body that is stronger, that is more coherent, that speaks with one voice. But we shouldn't discount the successes that the region has had in bringing down internal barriers, in allowing greater labor mobility, in the recognition of each other's certifications, the new e-commerce and logistics green lanes, and the supply chain connectivity, the transportation routes. We see more and more a young ASEAN generation that has lived in each other's countries, studied in each other's countries. So it's a slow and steady process, and no doubt the institution of ASEAN has played a very important role in that. But does ASEAN have to be a bloc? No, it does not have to be a bloc, right? And I resist this notion that we fall into a trap of viewing situations either as rigid blocks or as anarchy. To me, all of Asia in general and ASEAN in particular is a sponge. It's a sponge in which we absorb and learn from each other, and we find those complementarities with each other. A lot of people have criticized that intra-ASEAN trade levels are relatively low. But that is explained by two very obvious factors. First of all, poor regions tend to not have very high degrees of internal trade. As ASEAN gets more wealthy, though, of course it will have that. And secondly, because ASEAN countries are so integrated in global supply chains, they by definition have very extensive global trade relationships internationally, and therefore not as high a quotient with each other. That too can also change. So we need to worry, much less about statistics and worry more about the potential. Are we maximizing the potential of our relationships with our own neighbors? And I think that mentality is clearly ever more present here in the region.
Good. There's a question here about going back to your broader concept of Asian leadership in the post-pandemic world. Two parts of this question, which is in leadership discussion, possession of soft power is important. And two, you have to have exercise of leadership. From what has happened in the past few decades, leadership has to be exercised either singly by an outstanding leader or through some organizational format, like we just talked about ASEAN. So, soft power, you need also organization to display and exhibit and lead the Asian countries. What do you think?
Well, this relates a bit to the first question about the characteristics of Asia, whether it is as a singular leader or multiple leaders. Does it speak with one voice? Is it supranational? And the answer again is that these are not prerequisites for leadership. If we're talking about, first of all, hard power matters more than soft power. Institutional power matters more. connectivity power in terms of the density of relationships, of infrastructure and technology matter more. And then lastly are these issues of soft power. And I always use the term soft power in quotes because, quite frankly, I do not belong to the school that considers that term actually important or relevant. I believe it's far too fungible a characteristic, very volatile, very difficult to measure, certainly extremely difficult, if not impossible, to find a case where soft power had a significant impact on a decision versus these other far more significant variables. So I actually don't use the term at all. What I believe is that, again, Asia has a multiplicity of leaders depending on the domain. Japan is a very strong leader in investment as a role model of a modern democratic state. It has a very significant trade and investment footprint around the region. China is a leader, of course, in the region in its own ways. It has a very strong cultural footprint, enormous economic footprint, and diplomatic and strategic, but not hegemonic. Even if it tries to, there is obviously the presence of other players, such as Japan and India and others, who, through different kinds of institutions. We talked about the Quad earlier, and other configurations that are also trying to assert their leadership. So you can have competing leaderships on different issues and sets of issues coexisting in a region as highly complex and diverse as Asia is. So I speak about a collective Asian leadership because that is what Asian leadership looks like in the real world. It is not for theory, it's not for reality to bend itself to suit one particular theory. We need theories that better explain our realities. And the reality that we have is not something that is so unique in history because it is far more consistent with Asia's past than it is with some of our abstract Western-derived theoretical models, because this is what Asian history has largely been characterized by for 4,000 years, is a multiplicity, a diversity of cultures and civilizations that had conflictual as well as commercial and cultural ties with each other simultaneously without the need for a singular leader. And that is actually the pattern of Asian history. It's the reality of Asia's present. It's probably the reality of Asia's future and the global future as well, which is why I strongly advocate, as a growing number of scholars do, that we start to build our theoretical models far more on the basis of a global history with a strong role for Asia than merely on the basis of European history.
Good. Last one then. In my dealing with the American colleagues, they have always insisted that they are part of the Asia Pacific. So for your vision of the Asian leadership, how can countries like Japan and others that have relied on the United States, and for the people in the US itself, they themselves see themselves as part of the Pacific arena? Although these days we are trying to redefine it by calling the region Indo-Pacific. So maybe in 2 minutes as we close, have a bit of views from you on how you see the US looking at this Asian leadership and going forward.
It's a very good question. Well, I have emphasized in the book actually that the United States is a Pacific power and remains a Pacific power, and certainly for any time frame that is relevant to speak of will remain a Pacific power. But it is of course not an Asian power geographically speaking, and that's a very critical distinction. A lot of people describe America as an Asian power, but it's a Pacific power. It has allies in Asia, it has alliance relationships in Asia, but it is itself not an Asian geographical country. And again, that's a very, very important distinction. Now, America's relationships are in flux, of course. We cannot rely on the post-war dynamics and post-war alliance system to define either America's role in Asia in the 21st century or Asia itself. Instead, there is also an Asian-centric order, an Asian system, as I've described it, that is building, and American diplomacy, American strategy has to adapt to that. It's seeking to do so with the shift towards an Indo-Pacific command, stronger relationships with countries like India than in the past, Vietnam as well, Indonesia, as well as a modification of its relationships with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia. So no doubt the United States still has a very strong strategic and economic relationships here in the region, but they are certainly in flux. And whether or not there is a clear, rigid formality to them is doubtful. Because in Asian history, we tend to not have rigid alliance systems, if you will. Instead, we have much more fluid dynamics. The word alliance does not appear nearly as much, of course, in studying Asian history as in Western history. So the US will have to adjust to that reality of greater fluidity and the nuances of it. But I think that Asians at this point are obviously best served in resolving their conflicts themselves. I'll remind everyone that the U.S. diplomatic role here is still critical if you look at the tensions between even modern allied countries like Japan and South Korea. The United States behind the scenes has been playing a very crucial role in maintaining some degree of a harmony between them. And that reflects, quite frankly, very, very poorly on Asian powers, that they cannot settle, and adjudicate their own disputes without the United States playing a role. But that applies in that situation, not in all situations. What I think we should all want to see in Asia, whether it is from the perspective of China, of Japan, of India, and other powers, is that Asians find ways to settle their own disputes without outside intervention. Because only then will Asian leadership genuinely have credibility around the world.
Thank you very much, Parag, for that wrap-up. I appreciate your candid sharing today, and I hope that our audience out there also feel that they have learned something from these 90 minutes with you. Thank you again, and on your behalf, I also want to thank the Ngee Kongsi for this generous support, and my colleagues in RSIS are thankful for Ngee Kongsi's consistent backing for all our activities. Parag, we hope to welcome you back, and this time maybe a face-to-face interaction with our Ngee Kongsi people as well as our students and staff. I have personally learned quite a lot from this afternoon's discussion, and I thank you again. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me close this session by thanking all of you to be out there joining us, and have a good day. Bye-bye.